We are very fast approaching a very special event. In 2 weeks' time, we are going to celebrate the fulfillment of a long, sometimes difficult process of amalgamation. On January 19th, we will join together at St. Andrew's Hespeler, and we will become a new amalgamated congregation. Now, up until now, we have mostly been working towards this goal separately. And I'd like to take a few moments to bring the folks at St. Andrew's up to date on how the folks at Knox have experienced this. See, in their discussions, there's one metaphor that they just kept coming back to, and that was the metaphor of marriage. As they were looking for a partner in amalgamation, they used words like dating and courting. They even came to look at their participation in our summer experiment as what they called speed dating. And do you remember those congregational meetings we held back at the beginning of November? Each congregation had to meet separately and vote to decide to begin the process of working out an amalgamation. And the folks at Preston met a week before the folks at Hespeler. And they said yes. Yes, they wanted to get together with St. Andrew's. But then they had to wait 7 days to hear our answer. Any guesses how that felt? Kind of felt as if they were down on their knees, holding out that jewelry box with the engagement ring in it. And the one they were proposing to said, hey, can we get back to you in a week? Kind of made for a bit of an emotional roller coaster. But with all of that in mind, I want to embrace that marriage metaphor as I think about what is coming to happen in a couple of weeks. In fact, I have the concepts of a plan to preach about the wedding of Isaac and Rebekah on that day. But I want to notice something today, and that's something that comes just before that marriage in the book of Genesis. Today we read the story of what happened before the wedding of Isaac and Rebekah, of the sad death and burial of Sarah, Isaac's mother. And I don't think we often realize the connection between those two stories in the Bible, because we tend to read Bible stories in isolation. But the story of Isaac's marriage ends by saying that Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So Sarah's death is only mentioned at the end, but it actually looms over the whole story of Isaac's marriage. He has suffered a great loss, a loss that seems to have broken him. And it's not just, by the way, that Isaac has lost his mother. In fact, it seems that he has also lost all contact with his other parent, Abraham. How else can you explain it that Isaac is not there for his mother's funeral? Or even for all of the arrangements around his own wedding. And Abraham isn't there for the wedding when Isaac takes Rebekah into his tent. It seems as if Isaac has just taken his mother's tent and gone off to live at a place called Beer Lahai Roy. Kind of odd, isn't it? What could possibly explain the utter rejection of a father by his son? Well, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but maybe it has something to do with the time when Abraham took Isaac, tied him up, put him on an altar, and held a knife to his neck. I do think that kind of trauma, even if Abraham did it for the right reasons, and yes, the Bible insists that he did it for the right reasons. That kind of experience might put a strain on a father-son relationship, don't you think? And I think that brings us to something we need to talk about here today. I do mean to celebrate a wonderful wedding in 2 weeks' time. But first, can we talk about the traumatic journey that brings us to this point? Can we talk about a congregation that has to process the end of a 134-year independent history? I mean, that's a hard thing to deal with under any circumstances. But some things have made this all that much more difficult. The circumstances, some difficult decisions made by the presbytery meant that the folks at Preston kind of felt as if they were up against a wall. They were given a very difficult timeline and necessity, and it was imposed upon them by the presbytery. And maybe that was necessary. Maybe nothing good would have come out of this without some external pressure. I don't mean to judge it, but I'm sure you can understand how that might have felt. And how it might have felt something like being tied up, laid on an altar for sacrifice, and having a knife held at your throat. So if, like Isaac, we are heading towards a joyous wedding, I would like to also recognize that, like Isaac, we are carrying some grief and some scars and maybe even some unprocessed trauma with us as we limp towards this wedding. And I can't help but feel that the passage we read this morning might have some good advice for us where we are right now. And the first thing I would note is this: Isaac doesn't seem to process his grief for what he has lost very well. I mean, he is completely absent as his mother is laid in her tomb. And this is not because he didn't love his mother or because he didn't feel her loss keenly. No, I believe it has a lot to do with his resentment of his father. His anger with his dad and what his dad has done prevents him from properly grieving what he has lost. Now, anger is a part of grief. Psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified anger as one of the essential stages in grief. So we need to accept our anger that we feel. We need to process it by asking where it's coming from, whether it's legitimate. But getting stuck in your anger doesn't really help you. And I think that's what Isaac has done. And I think that's one good reason for why he unnecessarily struggles with his loss for so long. The endings that we are marking this month are real. The rituals and the services are there to help us work through that loss in constructive ways. And so I hope you do not make the mistake that Isaac made and rob yourself of the opportunity to take part in them because you're mad at presbytery or whatever leadership has brought us to this place. Your failure to participate won't actually hurt those who you feel have hurt you. You'll only hurt yourself. So I think that's one key thing we can learn from Isaac's grief. But what can we learn from Abraham's? The death of Sarah seems to force Abraham to come to terms with his nomadic status. He's been living in Canaan as a wanderer for a very long time. And he's actually done well with that status. So much so that the Hittites apparently see him as a mighty prince living among them. So he's never really suffered from having no place to call home until the loss of Sarah hits him. And it hits him like a ton of bricks. All of a sudden, Abraham realizes that he needs a place where he belongs. And I'm sure that the folks at Knox can relate to Abraham and what he is feeling. Because you are losing an anchor in your lives. A place that helped you to know who you were and where you belonged. And at moments like this, I think you realize, like Abraham, your deep need to find new places of belonging. And so that's what this whole passage is about. Abraham sets out to find a place, just like the folks at Preston set out to find a partner. And there's something really interesting about the story. The question comes up about whether Abraham should pay for this, right? So once Abraham has discovered the place where his family, he feels like his family could belong for all time, he goes to the Hittites, in whose land it is, to try and obtain the property. And they react strangely, to say the least. Both the Hittites as a whole and the man who owns the property clearly want Abraham to have it. They want him to have a place. But they insist over and over again that they don't want him to pay for it. Now, it's kind of hard to know exactly what's going on here. This might just be a unique look at how people bartered in that culture. What might be going on, that's what might be going on when Abraham keeps insisting that he must pay until finally Ephron, who owns the property, says, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." And then Abraham pays that price. But more than an insight into how things were done in that culture, I suspect that that exchange is there to teach us something important today. When you've gone through a great loss, the people around you, if they are compassionate, may well react like the Hittites in the story. They may say, "Oh, no, you've suffered too much. You've lost too much. You shouldn't pay anything more. Let us take care of it now." And that, to be clear, comes from a place of care, but it's not necessarily the most helpful thing that they could say. And Abraham is wise enough to recognize that it really isn't going to work for him. He can't just be given a place and feel as if it belongs to him. It must cost him something. Or deep inside, he will always have something telling him that it's not really his. You see, this too is an essential part of the grieving process. You must decide to invest yourself in something new moving forward. And until you do, your natural process of grief may be stunted. And I think there's a really important message in that for us. When you come out of a difficult experience of loss, you may be tempted to just coast. You may hesitate to invest yourself too readily in the life of the amalgamated congregation or whatever else your next stop in your personal spiritual journey might be. It's understandable. I mean, you've been burned before. The last time you invested yourself in a religious community, maybe it let you down. But do not listen to the Hittites around you, or maybe the Hittites in your own head saying, "What is that between you and me?" Yeah, the Hittites. Maybe telling you to step back and hesitate to engage yourself. But Abraham says, take a risk. Step forward with your 400 shekels of silver. Get involved. And I hope you understand in this that I'm not merely talking about making a commitment for financial support. I'm sure that's important, but it's hardly the only way. And I'm really not sure it's the most important part when it comes to dealing with grief or loss that you have suffered. Maybe you should concentrate at first on making new connections, putting yourself forward as a new friend. And to you who are welcoming new people into already established groups, welcome them as new friends with the expectation that they have wisdom and contributions to bring, because they do. And most of all, find a place where you can step in and begin to contribute time and energy and the gifts and the abilities that God has given to you. And that may feel like a risk. I mean, it is a risk. What if you get something wrong or make some mistake in this new context? Well, no one can guarantee that nothing will go wrong. But Abraham understood that if you do not take the risk, maybe you'll never discover where you truly belong. Abraham came to Canaan as an outsider, a wanderer, who kind of didn't really belong anywhere. And it's really interesting that his first foothold in this land was something that he found on the heels of the greatest loss he ever suffered, the loss of his wife. This is a reminder that grief and loss cannot be avoided in life. But such times also offer us some of our greatest opportunities to find ourselves, to find the place in life that God gives us. So the wedding's coming. It will be a great opportunity for celebration and joy. But take note of where you are now, because perhaps there's a reason why God brought you to this place as well. Thank you, God, for the difficult journey that brought us to this point. Thank you for the tools you give us to deal with our grief and loss. And thank you for the incredible opportunities you place before us. Amen.